September 25, 1986, Moscow. The Politburo of the Soviet Union is in session. General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev has asked KGB Chairman Viktor Chebrikov for a report on the people currently serving sentences for what Western governments were calling political crimes. Chebrikov runs through the numbers. 240 individuals, most of them, he suggests, could have their sentences reviewed. Then Gorbachev asks about the exceptions. Chebrikov pauses. There are two cases, he tells the room, where the sentence has already been carried out and cannot be reduced. One of them is a man named Adolf Tolkachev. Yesterday, Chebrikov says Tolkachev's sentence was carried out. Gorbachev's response, recorded in the Politburo transcript that would remain classified for nearly a decade, was 4 words. American intelligence paid him generously. He was right, they had, but money was almost beside the point. What Tolkachev had given the CIA between 1979 and 1985 was not something you could measure properly in rubles or dollars. He had given them the complete technical specifications of the radar and avionics systems inside the Soviet Union's most advanced combat aircraft. Every formula, every frequency, every performance parameter of the sensors inside the MiG-29, the MiG-31, the Su-27, the aircraft the Soviet Air Force intended to dominate European skies with in the event of war. He had given them this information years before those aircraft entered operational service. He had given it to them from inside a locked KGB-guarded research institute in Moscow, walking out past the security checkpoints every day for 6 years with film in his pocket. The KGB's own post-mortem on the Tolkachev case, reconstructed from what became available after the Soviet collapse, contains a conclusion so uncomfortable that Soviet intelligence officers reportedly struggled to write it down. The man had not been caught spying. He had been betrayed, from outside, by Americans. The KGB's own security procedures, its own surveillance systems, its own counterintelligence apparatus, none of it had identified him. He had walked through all of it for 6 years and only stopped when 2 traitors inside the CIA told the KGB his name. This is the story of how a quiet, unremarkable engineer at a top-secret Soviet military design bureau decided, alone, without recruitment, without coercion, without any contact from any foreign intelligence service, to destroy the Soviet air defense program from the inside, of how the CIA almost missed him 4 times before it finally paid attention, of what he actually handed over and what it did to American air combat capability, and of what the KGB files reveal about why, for 6 years in the most surveilled city on Earth, the system designed to catch exactly this kind of man never saw him coming. To understand why Tolkachev did what he did, you have to go back not to the Cold War but to 1938. That year in Moscow, during the height of Stalin's Great Purge, a woman named Natalia Kuzmina watched the Soviet state take her mother and her father. Her mother was executed. Her father was sent to the Gulag, to labor camps that broke men slowly enough that they sometimes survived to be released. He was released in 1955, after Stalin's death. He returned to Moscow and died shortly afterward. His body had given out. Natalia Kuzmina grew up in an orphanage. She became an antenna specialist at a Soviet military research institute. She married a quiet, reserved engineer named Adolf Tolkachev, who had grown up in Kazakhstan, studied at the Kharkiv Polytechnic Institute, and by the 1970s had become one of the chief designers at the Fazotron Design Bureau, the Soviet Union's largest developer of military radars and avionics, a closed institution so sensitive that its address did not appear on any public map of Moscow. Tolkachev stood approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall. He was not physically imposing. Colleagues described him as melancholy and reserved, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, and who could sit in a room full of people without being noticed. He read Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, the dissidents whose words circulated in samizdat. Handwritten and typed copies passed hand to hand because printing them was a crime. He held, in the carefully controlled expression of a man who had lived his entire adult life in a state where the wrong opinion could destroy a career or a family, a fury he had carried for 30 years. His wife's mother had been shot. Her father had been broken in a labor camp. The system that had done this was the same system he served every day, walking through the security checkpoint into the building where the Soviet Union's most sensitive aviation secrets were designed and stored. By the mid-1970s, Tolkachev had made a decision. He was going to make the system pay. The mechanism he chose was not sabotage, not defection, not an anonymous letter. He chose the one thing his position made possible, and that the system, paradoxically, had put within his reach. He was going to walk the Soviet Union's most classified aviation intelligence out of its most secured facility and hand it to the enemy. He was going to do this as an act of private, deliberate, completely personal revenge. And he was going to do it while riding the subway home to his apartment in Moscow every evening, past the same neighbors, past the same building supervisor, in the same ordinary life he had always lived. He began trying to make contact in January 1977. The method he used was the simplest thing he could think of. He knew that American diplomats drove cars with distinctive diplomatic license plates through Moscow. He waited near locations where American vehicles were likely to stop and tried to approach them. He would walk up to a car with American plates, try to get the attention of the driver, and attempt to pass a note explaining that he had information he wanted to discuss with an appropriate American official. In January 1977, he tried this. Nothing happened. The CIA officer in the car reported the approach, but headquarters in Langley, under Director Stansfield Turner, had ordered a stand-down on human intelligence operations in Moscow after 2 agents had been compromised and expelled. A Soviet citizen approaching an American car was more likely, in the prevailing institutional assessment, to be a KGB provocation than a genuine volunteer. Tolkachev tried again and again. Between January 1977 and February 1978, he approached vehicles with American diplomatic plates in Moscow 5 separate times. On one of those approaches, the car he knocked on belonged to Gardner Hathaway, the chief of the CIA's Moscow station. Hathaway received the note. Headquarters still said no. What changed was a memo. In early 1978, the Pentagon sent a request to the CIA asking for any intelligence available on Soviet aircraft electronics and weapons control systems. The request was specific. It described exactly the category of information that the man who kept approaching American cars in Moscow had said he could provide. The timing was, in the CIA's own later assessment, pure coincidence. The combination of Tolkachev's persistence and the Pentagon's memo finally shifted the institutional calculus at Langley. Permission was granted to make contact. On March 5, 1978, CIA case officer John Gilsher, a Russian speaker who had been assigned to the Moscow station, made contact with Tolkachev. They exchanged written notes. Tolkachev gave him 2 typewritten sheets containing details about the electronic systems of a Soviet aircraft. Gilsher reported back. Headquarters still moved slowly, still worried about a KGB dangle, still tried to manage the relationship through dead drops and written communication rather than in-person meetings. Tolkachev resisted this. He had not approached the CIA 5 times over 14 months to pass notes into hollow trees. He wanted to meet. He wanted to talk. He wanted, in a way that his CIA handlers would come to understand over the following years, to be seen. On New Year's Day, 1979, John Gilsher met Adolf Tolkachev in person for the first time. Gilsher would later note that Tolkachev was probably one of the very few sober people in Moscow on that particular holiday. He arrived at the meeting with 91 pages of handwritten notes. The notes contained, in Tolkachev's own precise engineer's hand, exact formulas, diagrams, drawings of oscilloscope presentations, weapon and electronic system specifications, charts, and direct quotes from classified documents he had accessed at Fazotron. Gilsher read what had been passed to him and understood immediately that the CIA's long caution about this man had been wrong. He was not a KGB plant. He was exactly what he said he was. What followed over the next 6 years constitutes one of the most productive intelligence operations in the history of the Cold War. 21 personal meetings between Tolkachev and his CIA handlers, conducted in parks and on street corners in Moscow, each one requiring the kind of operational preparation that David Hoffman, who would later write the definitive account of the case, compared to the concentration of a moonshot. CIA officers using disguises, decoy devices called jack-in-the-box dummies that could be left in a car seat to fool KGB surveillance while the real officer slipped away on foot. 2-hour surveillance detection routes through the Moscow metro system, all of it executed in a city where the KGB maintained one of the densest surveillance networks on Earth. At each meeting, Tolkachev delivered film, not the small, unreliable miniature cameras the CIA had initially provided, which produced blurred images that analysts could barely read. He had asked for a standard Pentax 35mm camera and a clamp to hold it steady against the back of a chair. He had worked out his own procedure. During his institute's lunch hour, while his wife was still at her own workplace and his son Oleg was at school, Tolkachev would carry classified documents out of Phasotron, finding gaps in the security procedures, exploiting a library checkout system that had no mechanism for filtering document withdrawals by subject, taking materials home in the ordinary bag of a man going home for lunch, and photographed them at his kitchen table. He would return the documents before the afternoon session began. He had found through careful, patient observation exactly how much the system trusted a man with his clearances and his record. It trusted him completely. In October and December 1979, after the switch to the Pentax, he delivered more than 150 rolls of film in each meeting. In one single meeting, he handed over nearly 200 rolls. The CIA's translation teams working through the material could not keep pace with what was coming in. They were still translating and studying what Tolkachev had provided in the early 1980s, well into the latter part of that decade. The internal CIA evaluations of his product read like dispatches from the far side of an intelligence officer's imagination. A March 1980 assessment praised his information on the latest generation of Soviet surface-to-air missile systems and noted that they had never before obtained such detail and understanding of such systems until years after they were actually deployed. An April 1980 memorandum called his information on jam-proofing tests for Soviet fighter aircraft radar systems unique, a word that in intelligence assessments means there was no other source in the world providing anything comparable. He had given them the radar specifications of aircraft that had not yet been delivered to frontline Soviet units. He had given them performance data for weapon systems still in development. He had given them, in effect, a window into the Soviet air defense future that American engineers and pilots could now plan against, counter, and defeat before the systems ever reached operational status. The F-15 Eagle was, in the late 1970s, the most advanced air superiority fighter in the American inventory. The electronics package being developed for it, a $70 million program, was designed against American assumptions about what Soviet radar systems could and could not do. Tolkachev's intelligence revealed that those assumptions were wrong in specific, measurable ways. The Air Force completely reversed direction on the electronics package as a result. The F-15C and D that came out of that revision were different aircraft from what they would have been without Tolkachev's information. American pilots who would one day fly against Soviet-built aircraft in combat over Iraq knew from the fighter weapons school tactical manuals issued in the late 1980s the precise performance envelopes and radar capabilities of the MiG-29 and Su-27. They knew because Tolkachev had told the CIA. The CIA had told the Air Force. The Air Force had told the pilots. Now set against this the question that the KGB's post-mortem would eventually, painfully, have to answer. How had Tolkachev operated for 6 years without being caught? The KGB's counterintelligence doctrine was built around a specific model of how a spy inside a Soviet institution would behave. The model was informed by the history of foreign recruitment operations, the Cambridge Five in Britain, the various penetrations of Western institutions that Soviet intelligence had achieved over the decades. The model assumed that a spy would be recruited. An officer from a foreign service would identify a vulnerable individual, make contact, apply pressure, or offer inducements, and turn the person. The recruited spy would then have a handler, a communication plan, a set of procedures designed and managed by the Foreign Service. This was the pattern. This was what the KGB's surveillance systems and internal security procedures were designed to detect. Tolkachev did not fit the model. He had not been recruited. He had recruited the CIA. He had approached them repeatedly over 14 months until they agreed to meet him. The entire initiative had been his. There was no foreign handler who had identified him as a target, no approach that the KGB's counterintelligence watchers might have observed, no moment at which a suspicious meeting had taken place in circumstances the KGB could have flagged. By the time the CIA was running Tolkachev as an asset, the operational pattern that KGB surveillance was designed to detect, an American officer making suspicious contact with a Soviet citizen, was already established as routine. He was a man who met with Americans. The meetings looked like what they were designed to look like, ordinary exchanges in a city full of people going about ordinary business. There was a structural blind spot underneath this. The KGB's internal security at institutions like Fazotron was built around the assumption that a man of Tolkachev's seniority, clearances and record was by definition trustworthy. He had passed every security review. He had served for decades without incident. He had colleagues who respected him and supervisors who regarded him as one of the institute's most capable people. The Soviet system of internal security depended heavily on the assumption that ideological reliability and professional standing correlated. A chief designer with 30 years of exemplary service at a sensitive defense institution was, by the system's own logic, the last person who needed to be watched. This assumption was not uniquely Soviet. Every security system makes similar calculations. You cannot watch everyone all the time, and the people least watched will always be the people most trusted. What made the Soviet system particularly vulnerable was the layer beneath the professional assumption. The KGB's internal review process for senior personnel at institutions like Fazotron had no systematic mechanism for tracking the private histories of employees' families. Tolkachev's motivation, his wife's mother executed in 1938, her father destroyed in a labor camp, was not recorded anywhere in his personnel file in a form that would have flagged a security concern. He had not spoken of it. He had not written of it. He had carried it quietly for 30 years in the specific manner of a man who had grown up understanding that the wrong word in the wrong room could cost a person everything. The investigation that did take place at Fazotron in 1983 focused on suspected leaks about a Soviet fighter aircraft target recognition system, came close enough that Tolkachev drove to his dacha outside Moscow, burned his spy kit, and drove back throwing pieces of equipment out of the car window. He had the cyanide capsule the CIA had eventually provided at his request positioned under his tongue when he was called into his supervisor's office. Nothing came of the inquiry. He was not the focus. His clearances were not reviewed. The investigation moved past him. He had survived an internal KGB security review while literally carrying a suicide pill in his mouth. What the KGB did not know was happening inside its own institution was a mirror image of what the CIA had for years been unable to do inside theirs. On June 13, 1985, Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer working in the Soviet and Eastern European Division at Langley, sat down with Sergei Chuvakin, a Soviet diplomat, in Washington. He gave Chuvakin a package of documents. Among the names in those documents was Adolf Tolkachev. Edward Lee Howard, a former CIA trainee who had been fired and had subsequently made contact with Soviet intelligence in Vienna, had likely already given the KGB enough to begin looking. Ames confirmed it. 2 Americans, one bitter and broke, one drunk and frightened of consequences he had already set in motion, had done in an afternoon what 6 years of KGB counterintelligence inside Fazotron had failed to do. On June 13, 1985, the same day Ames made his delivery in Washington, KGB Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Zaitsev orchestrated Tolkachev's arrest as he was returning to Moscow from the countryside. He was found carrying 2 million rubles. The KGB kept his arrest secret for months, using the knowledge of his exposure to pass false information to the CIA for nearly 10 months before the agency finally understood what had happened. In September 1985, the Soviet news agency TASS announced that a staff member at one of Moscow's research institutes had been arrested attempting to pass secret materials to the United States. The CIA learned that Paul Stombor, a CIA officer in Moscow who had been attempting to meet Tolkachev, had been expelled. The operation was over. Adolf Tolkachev was tried and convicted of high treason. His wife Natalia was arrested and imprisoned for 3 years on charges of supporting his activities, despite the fact that Tolkachev had gone to considerable lengths to keep her uninformed of what he was doing. Their son Oleg, for whose sake Tolkachev had requested Beatles records and Led Zeppelin albums and art supplies from his CIA handlers, tokens of the Western world he wanted his son to be able to touch, was left to navigate what remained of the family's life in Moscow. On September 24, 1986, Adolf Tolkachev was executed by shooting. He was 59 years old. The following day, Gorbachev noted in the Politburo session that American intelligence had paid him generously. KGB Chairman Chebrikov confirmed that this agent had handed over very important military technical secrets to the enemy. Neither man said what the KGB files that would later become partially available already showed, that the agency's own security apparatus had not caught him, that he had been identified by Americans, not by Soviets. That the most surveilled facility in one of the most surveilled cities on Earth had been penetrated for 6 years by a man who photographed classified documents at his kitchen table during his lunch break and walked them back past the security checkpoint before the afternoon session began. The verdict on the Tolkachev case, the honest one that the KGB's own institutional post-mortem eventually had to reckon with, is that the failure was systemic in the most precise sense of that word. It was not a failure of individual vigilance. It was a failure of the assumptions baked into the system itself. Soviet counterintelligence had been designed to catch recruited spies, and Tolkachev was not a recruited spy. It had been designed to flag suspicious contacts between foreign intelligence officers and Soviet citizens, and Tolkachev had made those contacts before the CIA agreed to receive them. It had been designed to identify motivated traitors through behavioral markers, sudden wealth, foreign associations, ideological deviation, and Tolkachev had spent 30 years perfecting the performance of a man who had none of these. He had asked for rubles, not foreign accounts. He had asked for his son's music, not his own safety. He had refused to leave the Soviet Union because his wife would be homesick. He had refused to defect, not because he was not afraid, but because he was not, in the end, running away. He was fighting. The CIA kept faith with him in the way institutions keep faith with sources that produce results beyond any other available. Senior officials stated that his intelligence justified the CIA's entire budget with Congress. A painting of Adolf Tolkachev, based on a photograph taken by a family friend in 1984, hangs today in a corridor at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. He is one of very few Soviet citizens honored this way. The men and women who handled him are mostly retired. Some have spoken about the case in fragments, in lectures at universities, and in interviews that appeared decades after the events they describe. Gilsher, who received those 91 handwritten pages on New Year's Day 1979, became a senior CIA officer. Hathaway, who first received Tolkachev's note at the gas station in 1978 and argued at headquarters for engaging this strange, persistent engineer, went on to lead CIA counterintelligence from 1985 onward, the very year the operation ended. Plunkett, who had jumped from a moving car into a Moscow December night to make contact with Tolkachev in 1982 when communications had gone dark, retired from the CIA and became a religion teacher at a Catholic high school in Arlington, Virginia. They had run a man through 21 meetings in the most hostile intelligence environment on Earth. They had received from him intelligence that American analysts were still studying a decade after his arrest. They had been unable to protect him from the institution he had trusted them to protect him from, because the damage came from inside their own building, not from the KGB's. The cyanide pill the CIA had given Tolkachev, the one he carried under his tongue when the internal investigation came too close in 1983, was not available to him when the KGB arrested him in June 1985. He had destroyed it with the rest of his equipment at the dacha when the earlier investigation had frightened him. He was taken alive. He was held for a year before the sentence was carried out. There is no available record of what he said or did not say during that year. What the KGB files said about Adolf Tolkachev ultimately was almost nothing of use. He appeared in a Politburo transcript as a number. 2 million rubles, very important military technical secrets. He appeared in KGB records as a successful counterintelligence case, because in the Soviet system the manner of his exposure by a foreign traitor rather than by Soviet surveillance was not the story the institution wanted to tell about itself. The story it wanted to tell was that it had caught him. The story it could not comfortably tell was that it had never been looking in the right place. The right place was a kitchen table in a Moscow apartment during the lunch hour, where a quiet man with a Pentax camera clamped to the back of a chair was photographing documents that would still be revealing secrets to American analysts when he was already in the ground. His wife's mother had been shot by the state in 1938. Her father had been returned from the Gulag in 1955, broken, and had died soon after. The son they had orphaned grew up to marry a man who spent 30 years waiting for the right weapon. When the CIA translators working through his film finally stopped being able to keep up with the volume of what he was sending, they were reading documents that described radar systems that did not yet exist in the physical world. He had reached into the Soviet Union's military future and handed it to the people designing the American response. He had done this from inside a locked building in the most watched city on Earth. Using a camera he had asked for himself with procedures he had devised himself, exploiting gaps in a security system that trusted him because men with his record and his clearances were not supposed to be the people you watched. The KGB's own files confirmed it. They had never caught the man who was spying inside their most sensitive avionics design bureau. Someone else had told them where to look. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit the like button. Adolf Tolkachev's painting hangs in a corridor at Langley, and almost nobody walking past it knows his name or the story behind the face. His wife served 3 years in prison for what he did. His son lived the rest of his life in the country his father had quietly hollowed out. These are not abstractions. They are the specific costs of the specific thing this specific man decided to do, alone, in 1977. When he began waiting near gas stations for American cars with diplomatic plates. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are more of these. Most of them are about ordinary people who made extraordinary decisions for reasons that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with what a government had done to someone they loved. They had names. They deserve to be remembered by them.